Something that has been receiving a lot of ink coverage, column inches, and video seconds, I guess, and reshares and all of this over the past few days since this atrocious act took place in Israel is the exposure, if we want to use that phrase, um, of this weird odd couple relationship that the far left has formed with the conservative Muslim, and how that this is such an irrational relationship. This is something that should not exist if the far leftists valued their life and values. But for some reason, they've chosen Palestine. They have chosen the Arab world as to be the horses that they're going to bet on, in contrary to the Jewish state, which ironically actually has the tendency to celebrate LGBT and far left political principles on a regular basis. It's this very strange, very counterintuitive relational dynamic that it, from the exterior, from the outside, really appears to be something more like an abusive relationship, honestly, like a battered woman syndrome almost, or something of that nature. It's very strange, but I think that there are some things that can be gathered, some principles that can be applied for the Christian to learn from. The first of which is that it should be no surprise whatsoever that the far left and the conservative Muslim have been able to hold hands given a common enemy, the Jewish state, because they both hate it with equal measure. And in part because of the fact that it's God's people, it's God's sacred nation. Don't let the supposed Christian cultists and stuff that would say that Christians have superseded Israel or something along that line, that no, Israel is definitely very close to God's heart still. And anyone that chooses to be against Israel also chooses to be against God himself, is allying themselves with the enemies of God. So that there's so much that is clearly pagan, that is clearly demonic in the far left, and there's so much that is clearly demonic and clearly satanic over in the conservative Islam, that it does in some ways make sense that these two things would hold hands with another, if for only one reason, and that is that it doubles their resources for the ability to take out a shared enemy. It's something that is, quite frankly, it goes all the way back to the art of war. Sun Tzu encourages his pupils to try to make friends with the adversaries of their adversaries, because it adds resources and it adds potency to any attacks, any whatever it is that you are intending to carry out against that adversary. It's just logical. It also, on a second point that is identified by Sun, is that it gives you an eyes-on relationship with that adversary that you are temporarily forming a truce with, that it allows you to see their strength potentially. It's something that has been a common military tactic throughout all of human history, quite frankly. You have the delicate allegiance that the Stalinists in Russia had with the Western allies during World War II, and you have, like, just, there's so many examples of it. I would not be able to list them all. So that's one reason. That's and I don't think it's, I mean, you'll hear thousands of videos, you'll see thousands of posts probably in the next few days about that concept. The second thing to learn about this is there is no neutrality. There is no concession from Satan's forces by appealing to or conceding to their values. That's one thing that we should, as Christians, learn from the left-leaning liberalism that exists within the Jewish state, within Jewish culture. They always vote Democrat. They always have very idealistic, hyper-liberal, leftist ideals. Always. I mean, it's been reported on plenty. They, in various outlets, that they skew much further to the left than many organizations here in the US. And yet, despite the fact that they share those same leftist political, ideological, in many ways theological principles with the far left of the West, they have been given no quarter to pay to benefit them from it. And so it's something I think a lot of Christian organizations are finally coming around to and finally coming light to over time, that you can concede values, you can concede territory, you can do whatever you want in order to try to appease leftist theologians and leftist politicians and leftist advocate groups and whatever it is. They will never respect you. They will never accept you. They will never value the same things you value. It is not a way into their hearts. It is not evangelistic in any way. It's actually just apostatic. Don't do it. Don't concede. Don't give in, because of the fact that you will gain nothing from it. You will make yourself a slave and to the very oppressors that you are afraid of. So that's the second thing, that there's no value in conceding to lies. There's no value to be had in allowing yourself to be trampled. None whatsoever. And that's something that we should learn from history. For some reason, we simply don't. The third thing that is worth highlighting is that one of the things that Jesus himself, as well as all of the New Testament authors, testified to was that they would know, the world outside, pagans, idolaters, would know that we have the truth. They would know that Jesus is the one way, the one truth, the one life, by our love for one another, with other brothers in the faith, and that they would know that by our love genuinely for our enemies. See, the thing about this weird odd couple relationship that exists with the far leftist and the conservative Muslim is it's only an odd couple when you consider their objectives from a secular worldview. It's only an odd couple when you consider their objectives from a secular worldview, because of course we know that the conservative Muslim has very different designs on this relationship than the leftist does. But when you consider a Christian worldview, affection for one's enemies is supposed to be first order natural. It's supposed to be the instinctive response of a Christian to the enemy. Now, of course, we don't ally with our enemies for the destruction of a Jewish state, obviously. That's not the point. The point is having a relationship with an enemy is supposed to be natural for Christians. The fact that we don't think that that's normal indicates that there's something broken in the American church, the Western church as a whole. Now, it's natural to react to an event like happened earlier in the last few weeks over there. It's natural to respond to that with a lot of instinctive emotion. Sure. And to want justice and even to want vengeance. But it's important to remember that Jesus himself said that no, he is the avenger. He is the one that pays back blood for blood so that we don't have to get our hands dirty. That in fact, even when Christians were being burned alive and being drawn and quartered and being thrown to animals and all the other things that were happening to them in the 1st, 2nd, 5th, 9th centuries, their testimony was one of love for the enemy. That they would pray and that they would sing hymns to, and that they would testify and they would evangelize the guards at their stakes, and that they would beseech and preach to those people while they're literally burning on fire to the executions. And there was actually evidence of those executioners, the soldiers, giving their lives to Christ because of that witness. Remember that the word witness originally means martyr. That's what is intended to invoke. So, with many, St. Moses the Black, the Apostle Paul, the Roman centurion at the crucifixion, like there's many instances of individuals who experienced things at the stake that reversed their opinions on this obscure Judean cult that was emerging. And so they went from enemies to allies as a result. They went from enemies to evangelists as a result, many of which have actually been canonized as a result. Like, this is a thing that has been the handmaiden of Christianity from the very beginning, but it's something we've lost on the one hand because of the fact that we don't suffer. Because we don't suffer, we have this illusion that we don't have enemies in this world. And because we don't have enemies, or we've convinced ourselves that we don't have enemies, we don't consider it a burden necessary to love them the way that Christ loves his enemies. And so we need to open our eyes to see that, yes, we do have enemies, and we need to be willing to extend them the open hand of friendship. If you read stories that are coming out of the Middle East, and you read stories through, let's say, Voice of the Martyrs or some of these organizations that are describing the things that are going on in the Middle East. Iran is having a major Christian revival, as well as things that are going on in North Korea, things that are going on in China, that one of the major ways that Christians have built inroads into having evangelistic conversations and bringing people into faith is an affection for those who are hostile against them. So, sum up. Number one, we should, in many ways, expect the kind of satanic, unholy alliance that exists between the far left and the conservative Muslim, because they're both being orchestrated by the same mastermind. It's the devil. The devil is at work in both of them, unfortunately. The second thing is that we should really be far more, I guess, sympathetic towards both of these, seeing them as, even though they are often hostile, even though they are often toxic towards Christians, we should see them through Christ's eyes, that yes, they are enemies, but they are enemies of God, and that when we stand in the way, we end up taking some hits as a result, but letting our blood flow to purchase the salvation of those who are far away from God. And that sometimes might mean that you have to get on a plane and you need to go. You need to take your family over there and you need to testify. Maybe. It might also mean that you just need to start writing some checks for the people that are willing to go and do and be among these people so that they can testify. And that we need to be far more open to suffering, recognizing suffering that's coming, as well as recognizing and uniting with those who are already suffering in this world, so that we can be a blessing to those who are suffering in Christianity. We need to stand by Israel. If you choose to be against Israel, you choose to become an enemy of God. There's no middle ground there. And then the next thing is that there's nothing to be gained by conceding intellectual or physical territory to the enemies of God. There's nothing of value that can be gained by doing so. Any attempt to concede to these people, their organizations, and their demonic ideologies will only result in more rope to hang ourselves with. We must recognize them as enemies and love them. We must recognize them as enemies and also love them the way that Christ has loved us. And that sometimes that means going to, sometimes that means negotiating peace with, and doing everything that we can to live at peace with everyone, but never compromising the understanding that they are still enemies until they give their lives to Christ.